Hey, Stefan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I saw the film this morning. I thought it was fantastic.
Oh,
I
thank you so much.
yeah. I mean, I loved all of it, but I really wanted to speak just to start off the interview with the early scenes because I love the way we saw the kind of the monster's breath, the kind of slow, limited vision that comes by looking through a
Hmm.
for a sniper lens. I just wondered how much fun is it directing horror and having that sort of power to play on the kind of tropes and use those little tricks to like this to kind of build that kind of and establish suspense and fear in that way.
It's so much fun. It's the most fun. I mean, I'm clearly living evidence of how much fun it is because I've worked in the horror genre for 20 years. Like, I just keep coming back to it. And it's such an addictive drug, the horror genre. I always liken it to comedy in the way stand up comedians refer to getting a big laugh as a drug. And that's what it's like getting a scream or seeing people in a theater do this and shrink back in their chairs. It's such a good feeling. And, going against the tropes, like you said, and going, okay, here's what the audience would expect. So I'm going to go this way is one of the most fun parts of it. You know, it really is. I'm glad you asked that because I haven't been asked about that before, but it really is fun to subvert people's expectations.
I would say there's kind of little moments like those I mentioned. They almost feel quite Spielbergian in some ways. I just wondered, is he a kind of conscious and important influence for yourself? Was he one of those filmmakers so kind of ingrained into the kind of fabric of cinematic storytelling that all filmmakers are influenced by him, whether they kind of know it or not?
I think they are. I think you're right. But with me in particular, I was born in exactly the right time. Like, you know, I was born in 77, the year, you're not supposed to say that in Los Angeles out loud. You know, it's the year Star Wars came out. I'm a Gen Xer, proud Gen Xer. Come on, Xers. And I was right in that pocket of like when I was 5, 6 years old, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T. and all that stuff was coming out. And, you know, as you know, at that time, it was so dominant. You know, even today, I think there's a lot more competition with movies. You know, you've got these amazing video games and the internet and all this stuff that's competing with movies. But in 1984, movies were the dominant form of entertainment, you know, and video games were still in their infancy. So I do think Spielberg had this huge effect on who I was. Just huge. And I was a suburban kid, you know, I wasn't watching Fellini films when I was 9 years old. You know, I was obsessed with big box office hits. And I think he's been with me my whole life. He's probably the one filmmaker that I could say, that guy's the reason I do this for a living, that guy.
You might not be watching Fellini films at 9 years old, but maybe at eight and a half.
I left it there for you. I left it there. It was
Debate.
just too easy. It was too easy. Someone from
Yeah.
the UK is going to be too quick.
Yeah. I mean, the performances here are superb. I mean, I've been a huge fan of Christopher Abbott's for some time, ever since I saw James White a few years ago. But I just wanted
Yes.
to know, I mean, not just from a kind of horror perspective, but even that chat they have on the steps outside Charlotte's work was such a masterclass in kind of acting. How much easier does it make your life when you're dealing with talented performers like Julia and Christopher?
It's not that it makes your life easier. It's that it. I mean, of course it does. But what it does is elevate what you're doing. Like a great actor, like Chris, like Julia, they can take words on a page and make it 30 times better than you had intended. I experienced this with Elizabeth Moss on Invisible Man. That's really the gift that the great actors give you is making everything. They give it a polish. It's like an upgrade. You know, they can take a 1986 Honda Accord and turn it into a vintage Ferrari. Like it's amazing what they can do. And I can't ever be thankful enough to them for what they did in this movie.
Yeah, because I was thinking when watching it, I was so impressed by the acting. And usually when that happens, especially around this time of year, we kind of speak about kind of performances as good as these with these kind of award season buzz. But it still feels like horror films are just not quite in the conversation enough. Do you think the genre can be unfairly kind of overlooked when it comes to the awards kind of season that we're in now?
Well, it's interesting you say that because when I started out, when James Wan and I did the first Saw film, I I felt like horror was really looked down on back then. What I mean is, I think it's come a long way. You know, I remember when Saw came out. The first Saw movie came out in October of 2004, and at that time, I feel like horror was like one step above porn in terms of industry respect and studio respect. in the ensuing years since then, we've seen this new thing that I'm sure you hate called elevated horror. Where it's like, oh, it's we shot it with lens flares and A24 released it, so it must be elevated, which is great. I love those films. I absolutely love Hereditary. I love The Babadook. I love all these films, and I think they've done a lot for horror's respectability. We saw The Substance win an award last night at the Golden Globes. So I think what you're talking about, it is changing, but I think it still has a ways to go in terms of where it should be, because it really is, the history of horror is the history of cinema,
And I'm not sure if it's because I've got a baby on the way that the kind of themes of fatherhood and generational trauma and how we can kind of become like our parents, sometimes a good thing, sometimes not, kind of really struck a chord with me. And I just wondered, I mean, what do you think makes horror such a wonderful vehicle to explore such important kind of themes? Why is it that sometimes going into the supernatural actually allows us to understand humanity more?
I think it's a great question. I think it's horror. It deals with such extremes. You're dealing with monsters, right? And monsters are great metaphors. It's a way of talking about something that you don't want to confront head on. If you have something to say about the refugee crisis in Europe or some issue, you can write a movie that deals with that issue directly, or you can wrap it in a horror film. It's like you're Trojan horsing it in, and I think it's an exorcism. I think horror films allow us to sort of expunge the worst of this thing through the horror genre, and they've always done that really well. But I think it's the extreme nature of horror films that allows it to do that.
I wanted to talk as well about the look of the Wolfman. I thought it looked great, and I loved the fact it was so kind of practical, not sort of relying on CGI. But how sensitively do you have to tread when dealing with the look of an iconic character like this? Because you obviously want to create something really new and really original, but there's always that kind of outside pressure to fulfill certain expectations some viewers may have. Or is it easiest when you are the filmmaker just to completely shut out all the noise and just focus on your own kind of vision for a film like this?
Well, it's funny because, like you said, Wolfman is so iconic. People do have these images in their mind. But the thing is, there's been a lot of Wolfman movies. And there's been, the famous Rick Baker transformation scene from American Werewolf in London. Like, how are you going to compete with that? He really, I think he kind of dropped the mic on the whole I transform into a wolf at the full moon thing. So what I started with was what's been done before? What have people already done? And what that allowed me to do is, once I had that column of things people had done, I could concentrate on what's the new thing that I could bring to this? What's going to be my mark? I will probably make only one Wolfman film in my lifetime, right? So what's the thing I'm going to say about it? And so that was really what I focused on. It wasn't so much about pressure as it was, what's my unique take on this,
I thought you succeeded in making Christopher look absolutely terrifying in this. But
actually, awesome. Thank you.
That leads me to my kind of next question, because I wanted to know how you dealt with Matilda, who plays Ginger, of course. I mean, when you have a kind of kid at the center of a horror film and they're confronted with some really kind of super scary moments, I guess as a filmmaker, you've got to try and manage a situation where you kind of explain the kind of context of the scene and need them to play fear without overstepping it. But when you're dealing with Chris in that prosthetics looking that scary, did you have to kind of manage that with her to make sure she wasn't too kind of overwhelmed by what she was seeing?
I actually didn't with Matilda. She was so beyond her years. She wasn't precocious. She was just so lovely to be around and mature in a quiet way. And I've had that experience you described before on the first Insidious movie. Young Ty Simpkins, who was very young when he did that movie, he was terrified of, like, we had many moments, James Wan and I, where we just felt awful because he was so scared. He didn't want to come out of the trailer. He's probably, now that he's 23 years old, he's going to kill me for saying this publicly, but he was very, very scared. And so I've dealt with that. Matilda was the opposite. She would just look at Chris and giggle. I shouldn't be saying that. I should be telling you some lie about how she was terrified, teeing it up. But Matilda is such a great actor that I think she already has that maturity of, like, we're just playing. We're having fun.
Well, I think that's sort of mostly out of time. But just before I go, I just wanted to say, just talking on the subject of kids, that kid Zach you got who plays a young Blake is the spitting image of Christopher. But you couldn't believe
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I find in movies, I always, whenever they cast the younger version of someone, I'm really hard on it. I'm like, come on, you're trying to tell me that. And there's been a few great ones, like the young Angelina Jolie. I think it was Ella Purnell in Maleficent. I was like, flawless choice. The kid who played the young Ray Liotta in Goodfellas, amazing.
Yes.
Remember, like, I looked at him and I was like, Scorsese, you did it. Like, that's the bar you have to measure yourself against. And so I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I kept asking people in the production office, does this look enough like Chris? But you're saying he does.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there was no like contrived like having to then say the name Blake so we all knew. Just that transition. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
No, exactly. You pan up and you hear Chris's voiceover go, yep, that's me.
Yeah.
30 years later. You just made my day. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Leigh, for speaking to me today. And best of luck with the release of the movie. And maybe we'll catch up again one day, I'm sure.
I wish I was in the UK right now, sitting across for you in some cool pub, having this conversation instead of on camera. I really wish I was in the UK.
Well, hopefully the next one will be in person. Cool.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey, you guys!
Hey, you guys!
Hey, that's what they all say.
Hey, you guys!